In addition to trivializing the movement, Right Streitmatter, the newspapers attacked feminists on the ground that they were abandoning their responsibilities in the home. This cartoon, on the one hand, ridicules the husband of the suffragist and the suffragist herself. Note that she is wearing the bloomers named for Amelia Bloomer, and note the state of her household and the diminutive figure of her husband, who is made to look feminine and tiny in his role as the husband of a suffragist. As Mott's description of the stages of the press suggests, the news media frequently resorted to ridicule in order to undermine the legitimacy of the suffrage movement. The New York Times, according to Streitmatter, took the position that women already possessed so much political power that to grant them any more would deny men their equal share in governance. The New York Herald, which was to become the movement's strongest opponent, referred to female leaders as having weakened. The New York Herald, which became the movement's strongest opponent, referred to the leaders of the movement as having weak and silly heads and as candidates for admission into lunatic asylums. James Gordon Bennett of the Herald made an argument that was both racist and sexist, suggesting that women were subject to men simply by virtue of their gender and by their nature were inferior in the same way that James Gordon Bennett of the Herald made an argument that was sexist and racist, simply suggesting that women were by nature inferior and therefore doomed to subjection. The behavior of the press reflects Lucretia Mott's description of the three stages the press went through in response to any social reform. The first of these was ridicule, which we can see ample evidence of in the press's coverage of the women's suffrage movement. The second stage is to simply report without comment, and this stage is somewhat clipped in the case of coverage of women's suffrage because the news media stayed in stage one until the writing was on the wall, at which point they began some level of report without comment, followed by advocacy for a cause they had been the primary obstacle to the achievement of. One of the things that was clear from the nature of the mainstream press coverage was that the women's movement was going to need to create publications of their own if they were going to have a voice of their own. In January of 1868, Stanton and Anthony founded the Revolution with the motto, "Men, their rights and nothing more, women, their rights and nothing less." Stanton made it very clear within the pages of the Revolution that suffrage was merely a means to an end, not the end. And if you look at the social issues that she addressed, it becomes clear what the nature of the end is. Those issues that she covered included abortion, divorce, and prostitution. And so in the case of divorce, for example, where under the current legal system, women were at the mercy of the men. A woman's wealth became her husband's upon marriage, and upon divorce she had no recourse to reclaim any of that wealth. Women had no control over reproductive issues, and so the abortion issue, all of these issues that Stanton wrote about in the pages of the Revolution were not going to be acted upon until women had the vote, was the position of Stanton. So the vote was a means to eventually improving the lot of women by electing politicians who were more sympathetic to the issues of women. Unfortunately, because of the Revolution's radical stances for the time, it was unable to attract funding, and it went under 2 years after it began. The difference between the Revolution and other publications illustrates that there was no one feminism of the time, that there was disagreement amongst those who were fighting for women's suffrage. There was disagreement right back to the founding of the American Equal Rights Association in 1866 to fight for universal suffrage. There were many in the women's movement who were disappointed by the 15th Amendment, were disappointed that black males, including Frederick Douglass, for example, were willing to accept this compromise, if you will, whereby black males received the vote, but women continued to be denied the vote. And it's at this point that Stanton and Anthony founded the National Woman Suffrage Association to focus exclusively on gaining the vote for women. Lucy Stone, on the other hand, along with her husband Henry Blackwell, formed a less radical organization, the American Woman Suffrage Association. Stone started a publication, the Woman's Journal, that was much less radical, a less radical outlet for the ideas of the women's suffrage movement. It focused on not only suffrage, but far less threatening issues of feminism, such as women's clubs and higher education for women. And because of its moderate tone, it was far more successful than the Revolution. In fact, it published uninterrupted from 1870 through 1933. The art editor for the Woman's Journal was Blanche Ames, who created the political cartoons for the journal, and her cartoons were also published in the Boston Transcript, so that they achieved a wider audience than just that of Woman's Journal, which was one of the challenges of the suffrage press, a press that by and large tended to preach to the choir. But her political cartoons effectively stripped away the rhetoric surrounding an issue and boiled it down to what the choice was. The picture on the left representing the anti-suffrage view of woman, which was a woman who was irresponsible, a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, idle, and most of all, a woman who was inferior, as opposed to the figure on the right, which, notice, embraces the woman's sphere, but does so in a way that suggests, well, if we cherish these things, that is, if we cherish these components of the feminine, motherhood, sisterhood, cooperation, service, companionship, love, education, and religion, you can see all of the ways in which women could be represented as bringing positive qualities to the election. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin founded Woman's Era. One of the great weaknesses of the suffragist press was that it was typically driven by individual editors and targeted to an audience of primarily middle and upper class white women. The exception to this is Woman's Era, founded by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, a member of Boston's African American elite, and Woman's Era became a nationally circulated monthly newspaper, and again, like others, she drew upon her experience in the abolition movement. Overall, the most significant contribution of the suffrage press, as Streitmatter points out, was not on ordinary Americans, but on the movement itself. It helped to make members feel connected. Remember, because it is an ideological movement, the members are not necessarily geographically situated in close proximity to one another. And you can imagine how isolated you could come to feel if you were part of a community without other like-minded men and women. The journals of the suffrage movement also helped keep women aware of suffragist activities, both nationally and in their communities. The suffrage press also articulated a suffragist ideology and then provided women with arguments to support that ideology in their own communities, and in the process tended to reinforce the shared sense of purpose of suffragists across the nation. The mainstream media continued its assault on the movement and continued to make it not an assault on the ideas of the movement, not a direct address of the ideas and taking them apart through rational, moderated argument, but through an assault on the individuals of the movement, for example. Susan B. Anthony was particularly vulnerable to this because she remained a single woman in an age where a woman who did not marry by a certain age was a spinster, and the assumption, of course, was that the proper goal of a woman was to be well married. And so papers like the New York World and the Richmond Herald took shots at Susan B. Anthony for her spinsterhood as they would have perceived it. Of course, from her point of view, it's her independence that they are attacking, and there's a great deal of truth to that. As a single woman who is successful within the movement, who is internationally known within the movement and for her role in the movement, she represents a threat to the idea that the only way for a woman to find fulfillment in this world is to marry. According to 19th Century magazine, the typical women's rights advocate was loud and dictatorial, suffered no one's opinion to influence her, had no respect for laws hallowed by time, nor custom consecrated by experience. And this attack on the women's movement by somehow appealing to custom, of course, is representative of this concept of hegemony that we discussed earlier in part 1. The idea that they defy custom as an argument without presenting any rationale for maintaining the custom, particularly the custom of male dominance, the custom of patriarchal systems, is designed not to address the arguments being presented by the women, but to sidestep the arguments and just say this is the way it's always has been and always should be. Most historians agree that the women's suffrage movement succeeded not because of the news media, but in spite of the news media. There were several factors that led to the eventual success of the movement, one of which was the rise of the progressive movement, which readily embraced the suffrage movement, if for no other reason than for the pragmatic reason that it represented a source of votes. I believe there is more to it than that, insofar as the progressive movement embraced a general challenge to the status quo, a general challenge to entrenched power, the entrenched power of political corruption, the entrenched power of political influence, and sought to expand democratic participation, to include more people in the democratic process, and more people in this case, of course, meant to include women in the political process. The progressive movement held to a conviction that government had to play a role in solving our shared social problems and in establishing fairness in economic matters. Another factor in the eventual success of the movement was the expansion of the movement to the working class. We mentioned earlier that the publications tended to target middle and upper class white women, and that was one of its weaknesses in the early portion of the movement. In 1907, Blatch deliberately sought to expand the membership to the working class, founding the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, which would later be renamed the Women's Political Union. The core membership of the organization was some 20,000 factory, laundry, and garment workers from the Lower East Side of New York City. And it was through this group then that Blatch organized and led the 1910 New York suffrage parade. The parade is going to become emblematic of a transition from simple persuasion to direct action, a transition similar to the one that the abolitionist movement had to undergo. The end result of all of this, of course, is going to be the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the vote. Alice Paul represents the outcome of this transition. She formed what was later to become the National Woman's Party, and her militant tactics led to women being harassed and even imprisoned. And in this case, women were able to use the stereotypes of women and the position of women in society to attract public outrage over this harassment and the imprisonment, and certainly introducing hunger strikes amongst imprisoned women added to that public outrage. American journalism came late to the game in granting the movement fair coverage. It began to change its tone only when the writing was already on the wall. The role American newspapers played in slowing the momentum for women's rights, concludes Streitmatter, is an example of the press abusing the mighty power it wields. Next time, we'll take a look at Chapter 4, Attacking Municipal Corruption, the Tweed Ring.